안녕하십니까. 자본시장연구원 이인영 선임연구위원입니다. 최근 한국 상장기업들의 기업가치 저평가, 소위 말하는 코리아 디스카운트 논의가 활발합니다. 여러 가지 의견이 있겠지만 오늘은 기업의 주주환원 정책과 기업가치에 초점을 맞춰보도록 하겠습니다. 이를 위해 논의에 도움을 주실 알렉스 에드먼스 교수를 모셨습니다. 에드먼스 교수는 옥스퍼드 대학교 졸업 후 모건 스탠리에서 4년 재직을 하였습니다. 그 후 MIT에서 재무 박사학위를 받았습니다. 펜실베니아 워튼 스쿨에서 2013년까지 정교수로 지낸 후 현재는 런던 비즈니스 스쿨 정교수로 기업 재무를 연구하고 있습니다. 지배구조, 임원보수, 무형자산 가치 등을 주제로 30편이 넘는 논문을 톱티어 저널에 발표하였고 최근에 저술한 ESG, 파이코노믹스는 2020년 파이낸셜 타임스가 최고의 비즈니스 책으로 선정을 하였습니다. 학술 활동 외에 다보스 월드 에코노믹 포럼, 세계은행 이사회 저명 인사 시리즈에서 발표, 영국 의회 및 정부 정책 자문을 꾸준하게 해오고 있고 현실 문제에 대한 본인의 견해를 월스트리트 저널, 파이낸셜 타임스, 하버드 비즈니스 리뷰 등에 다수 기고하고 있습니다. 바로 첫 번째 질문으로 들어가도록 하겠습니다. 코리아 디스카운트는 수년간 투자자들 사이 그리고 학계에서 논의가 지속되어 왔습니다. 그 원인에 대해서는 여러 가지 요인들이 있겠지만 그중 미약한 주주환원 정책과 지배주주와 소액주주 간 괴리가 유력한 원인으로 거론되고 있습니다. 한국에서 ESG, Far Economics로 번역되어 출간된 에드먼스 교수님의 저서에서 기업의 배당과 자사주 정책의 장단점에 대해 논하고 있습니다. 기업의 저조한 주주환원은 기업가치 할인 요인으로 볼 수 있을까요?
Yes, absolutely. So one big reason for a potential discount is a poor shareholder return policy. So shareholders commit capital to a company. They give you capital not to get it back immediately. They give that capital in the hope that it will be invested productively. But there's always a limit to the number of positive net present value projects that a company will have. And after a company has taken those positive projects, it should return that capital to shareholders in the form of dividends and share buybacks. And you might think, well, it's interesting for somebody like me to say this, because there's a lot of people who argue that companies should always invest, particularly if a company wants to be responsible for society, it should invest in its stakeholders. But as I explain in the book, Grow the Pie, even if you're a stakeholder-focused company and you think about the long term, there will always be a limit to the number of net present value projects that you can undertake. And therefore, a good company will have discernment. It will understand which projects to take and which to turn down. And if it will turn down certain projects because they're not net present value positive, then it should return that capital to shareholders. And what is the evidence for this? There was a lot of nice academic evidence looking at how much cash is valued if it's owned by a company. You might think that $1 should be valued at $1 if it's on the balance sheet, but it's not. It's valued significantly less, and it's valued even less if a company has poor corporate governance, which will be something I'm sure you're going to get onto in a subsequent question.
좋은 주주환원 정책이 장기적으로 기업 가치를 향상시킨다는 학술적 연구가 있습니다. 미국에서의 연구에 따르면 자사주 매입과 소각은 모든 요소를 고려할 때 기업 가치를 12% 증가시킨다고 합니다. 그러나 이러한 연구는 주로 사후적 관점에서 얻은 관찰에 기초하고 있습니다. 막상 행동주의 펀드가 높은 배당금과 자사주 소각을 요구하고 반면에 기업은 장기 성장을 위해 잉여 현금 흐름을 보유해야 한다고 강변할 때 다른 투자자들은 어떤 관점을 갖고 한쪽 손을 들어줘야 하나요?
That's a great question. So I think the first thing is to recognize the existence of agency problems. So what is an agency problem? If you're the CEO of a company, you might not be aligned with shareholders. Why? Because you might have incentives to grow the firm. The larger the firm that you have, the greater the prestige, and therefore you might grow it beyond the point at which it maximizes shareholder value. And so one striking example from Korea was Daewoo, the conglomerate. So it started off being in textiles and clothing, and that was something which made a lot of sense because Korea had a affordable, large workforce, but then it expanded into many things far beyond its initial focus, and then it ended up having to be broken up. So CEOs have an incentive to grow the firm because they want to empire build. So one thing that you might want to look at is the CEO's alignment with shareholders. And so one thing that I do in my own research is I emphasize the importance of a large equity stake in the firm. So if you have a large equity stake in the firm, then you are much less likely to take actions which are in contradiction with long-term value creation. We should also recognize that a good car has both accelerators and brakes. So even if you have a company which is run by an entrepreneur, which has a lot of great ideas, we have to recognize that sometimes they might not realize that certain projects that they do believe to be value creating are actually not value creating. And so this is why it's useful to have the perspective of an outside investor who is more independent, who's more neutral, and who can say, well, actually, there might be better uses for your cash, which could be to return this to shareholders. But just like we want to look at the stake that a manager has in his or her company, we also want to look at the stake that the activist has. So if the activist has a larger stake, then evidence suggests that they're much more likely to make proposals which are in the long-term interests of the company. So I think those are the first two things to look at: the stake size of the CEO, the stake side of the outside investor. You might also look at the track record of both. So when the CEO has made acquisitions in the past, what has been the market reaction to those acquisitions? Look at the investor. If they're an activist and they've pursued activism in other companies, what was their track record? Was it the case that share buybacks and dividends have led to long-term value creation or been at the expense of long-term value? Because exactly as you mentioned, there is academic evidence that in general, share buybacks are value creating in the long term. So the popular narrative is share buybacks are short-termist. You pump up the short-term stock price, and in the end, the company fails in the long term because it hasn't invested. That is not true on average in the data. Share buybacks lead to an increase in the short-term stock price, and it continues to grow up over a long period. But absolutely, that doesn't mean that share buybacks are always good in every single situation. So that's only an average result. So it could be that you have an activist investor who is associated with the short-term type of share buybacks. So you'd like to look at that investor's track record to see whether the share buybacks it has initiated has led to long-term value creation or value destruction.
배당과 자사주 정책에 대한 질문입니다. 기업 입장에서는 자사주 정책이 배당 정책보다 선호될 수 있는 요인이 있는 것 같습니다. 배당을 해오던 기업이 갑자기 배당을 줄일 경우 기업 현금 흐름에 대한 부정적인 신호로 받아들여질 수 있어서 주가가 하락할 수 있습니다. 미국의 경우 배당 축소는 평균 4% 주가 하락 원인으로 실증되고 있습니다. 반면에 자사주는 그런 효과가 나타나지 않고 있습니다. 그럼에도 불구하고 배당 정책으로 소요되는 금액은 자사주 매입보다 많고 더 선호됩니다. 그 원인은 무엇인지요? 배당 정책과 자사주 매입 정책의 장단점에 대해 말씀 부탁드리겠습니다.
Actually, no, because for tax considerations, buybacks are better than dividends. So if you receive a dividend, you have to pay income tax, and income tax is typically higher than capital gains tax. Also, with a dividend, you have to pay that income tax immediately, whereas if there's a capital gain, you don't need to pay capital gains tax until the share is sold. So you could choose to sell your share at a later stage, even if the stock price has risen. So from tax considerations, dividends are actually less attractive than buybacks. Also, in terms of capital return to shareholders, as you're saying, dividends are far less flexible. So if you have paid a dividend in the past, you are, quotes, committed to continuing to maintain that dividend, because if you don't do so, the stock price will drop if you cut the dividend. Whereas with share buybacks, you can shop and change buybacks from year to year without any negative consequences. So if a Korean company was to find itself flush with cash in a particular year, which it doesn't need to use because it's taken all its positive NPV investment projects, it should return it to shareholders in the form of a buyback. And it doesn't need to worry if next year it has lots of great investment opportunities that it cannot otherwise finance. It could cut the buyback to finance them. So given all this, given that dividends are tax disadvantaged, and they are less flexible, why might it be that in many countries dividends are better, are more preferred than buybacks? One of them is just history. Is in the past, dividends were used and buybacks were much rarer. In the US, buybacks were illegal until the 1980s. And given that once you've started paying dividends, you can't actually stop, that was historic accident is that if you've paid them in the past, you still have to pay them going forward. So that's not a good reason from first principles. That's just the prisoner of history. Indeed, if you look at a lot of the tech companies like Meta and Amazon, they did share buybacks way before they started paying dividends because they didn't want the inflexibility. But there's a second reason where one might say this is a good reason for dividends, which is the inflexibility might be good if you are in a company with agency problems and problems of free cash flow. Because the fact that a high dividend one year continues to commit you to pay those dividends in future years, if you have a company which is always generating excess cash and always has more cash than the investment opportunities, actually paying dividends are a better way to address that excess cash problem than buybacks, because buybacks, that flexibility could allow the CEO in future years to waste that money. So if indeed you have a Korean company which is mature and systematically and consistently generating high cash, which is more than it needs to invest organically, then I would use dividends rather than buybacks because of that discipline.
경우에 따라서는 배당 성향이 30에서 40%인 상장사가 자신들의 배당 정책을 명시화하지 않는 경우를 볼 수 있습니다. 반면에 배당 정책을 명시화하지 않지만 실질적인 구속력이 전혀 없는 경우도 있습니다. 실효성 있는 배당 정책을 강구하는 방안으로 무엇을 고려해야 할까요?
That's another good question. And as you're suggesting, it's not one size fits all. So with dividend policies, I think in many companies they can be useful, but in other companies they could be more constraining. So when would they be useful? So they would be useful if indeed there is a concern of agency cost or free cash flow. You might be worried that the manager would use their discretion to keep cash within the company and waste it in order to empire build. And one good thing about a dividend policy is if it's written in stone that if your cash flow passes a certain level, you need to pay it out, that limits the discretion. But sometimes discretion is good. Where might discretion be good? Because there's lots of things which might not be written into a contract. So if a company has some great investment opportunities, those investment opportunities are unobservable to outsiders. Maybe only the executives will know those investment opportunities. And it may well be that a CEO thinks that even though my cash flow generation is good, I still want to keep the cash inside the company. Why? Because there's some great investment opportunities internally. There's the potential for bolt-on acquisitions. Those things are unobservable. They're not contractable. You can't put them in the contract. And you might want the CEO to have some flexibility to keep cash in the firm because there's some good internal investment opportunities to pursue or external bolt-on acquisitions. This will also depend on how much trust you have in the executive. So if the CEO is somebody with a large stake in the company, then you would be willing to trust that they're going to make the decisions in the long-term interest of the firm. So let's go to Amazon, which has been around for several decades. Amazon has never paid a dividend. Why are people not concerned that that money will be wasted? Well, number one, there's a lot of great organic investment opportunities. And number two, the CEO and the founder has a large stake in the firm, so he's unlikely to be wasting the cash on negative NBV projects.
한국에서 자사주 매입은 긍정적이기보다는 부정적인 시각으로 인식될 수 있습니다. 소위 말하는 자사주 마법이나 자사주 수합의 경우와 같이 따라서는 소액주주의 이익에 반하는 지배주주의 경영권 강화에 사용될 수 있기 때문입니다. 잉여 현금 흐름을 주주에 환원하지 않고 그 이유도 밝히지 않은 채 보유하고 있다면 문제가 된다고 봅니다. 영국에서는 자사주 소각이 의무화되어 있지는 않지만 대부분의 기업들이 소각하고 있는 것으로 알고 있습니다. 자사 소각은 반드시 바람직한 것일까요?
Yeah, so I typically think cancellation is a good idea for all the reasons that you suggest. It's something which prevents controlling shareholders having too large a stake in the company, and this is good to try to address conflicts of interest between controlling shareholders and minority shareholders. Another good reason for cancellation is that if in the future the company needs to raise funds, it should be issuing new equity. And why is that a good thing? Because the market can then ask itself, is this new equity something that we would like to buy? Is the company raising equity for good reasons or bad reasons? So if every time you need to go to the capital market to raise new capital, the market has to scrutinize what you're using the capital for, that is good discipline, because it means that you're only going to be able to raise capital if there's a productive use for that, rather than the company being able to reconvert its treasury stock. So I generally think that this is a good idea. Whether to make it mandatory is a bit more of a grey area. The issue with making something mandatory is that suggests that in no case is treasury stock a good idea, is non-cancellation a good idea, when one might think, well, there could be a good reason where if you might want to reissue the stock later, and because of information asymmetry, the market does not recognize that you're doing that because you have a positive NPV project, it might be that in certain cases, you might want not to cancel. So even if it's not mandatory, as you say, in the UK, it could just end up being good practice for companies to cancel. And I think that might be a better way of going. So in the UK, the corporate governance code is comply or explain. So they say there's certain things that you need to have, which is a CEO and chair are different. You need a majority of independent directors. But if you choose not to do that for good reasons, then you can explain that. And if in Korea, it would be generally well understood that after a share buyback, you cancel the shares, but this is not mandatory, then you do have some flexibility and some leeway for companies to say, yes, we've done the share buyback. This is the reason for non-cancellation. And if it is a good reason, then the market will respond positively. If it's a bad reason, the market will know that given the general good practices to cancel, and they've not given a good reason for why they haven't done that, then the stock price will react negatively. So even if you don't have hard and fast rules, if this becomes good practice, and it might be in some corporate governance guidelines, I think that is strong enough, and that still gives you some flexibility.
한국의 대기업은 그동안 지배주주가 소수의 지분으로 경영권을 장악하여 경영 효율성을 저하시키고 주주 간 형평성을 해치운 것으로 비판받아 왔습니다. 반면에 대기업은 지배력을 바탕으로 장기 투자가 가능했고 이를 통해 산업을 육성한 공로를 인정해야 한다는 의견도 있습니다. 주주의 단기 이익보다는 전체 파이를 키우는 역할을 강조합니다. 이 두 의견에 대해서 어떻게 평가하시는지요?
Yeah, so I think the best way to evaluate any argument is, to the extent possible, to look at the academic evidence, because this shows, well, what are the causes and consequences of high evaluations. And what is great is that on this particular topic, there was a study published in a top academic journal which focuses on Korean data. So one of the big problems with my profession is it's US-centric, and a lot of the top papers are using US data, and they might not automatically apply to Korea. But there's a paper by Sung-wook Jo, J-O-H, in the Journal of Financial Economics in 2003, which finds the following results. So number one, all else equal, when the largest owner of the company owns a higher share in the firm, accounting performance is higher. And that's consistent with some of my earlier remarks that if you have a large shareholder, they have greater incentives to ensure that the company's maximizing long-term value. It's also consistent with your argument, Mr. Lee, that if a company has a higher stake, it might be able to provide some more capital later, and this is something which will help it to grow. But what is the flip side of too large a shareholder? Well, if you have too large a shareholder, they might end up expropriating the company, and there could be conflicts between large and small. And so what is a measure of the potential conflict? It is the wedge between the larger shareholders' ownership rights, their cash flow rights, and their control rights. So you can have certain structures like pyramid structures, which allow you to have a much larger share a much larger say in the company than your actual cash flow rights. And so what is found is that when there's this greater wedge between your ownership of the company in terms of cash flow rights and your control in terms of voting rights, that's correlated with lower accounting performance. Also, you might want to look at, well, what happens with the cash which is generated, and when you are investing more in affiliated companies with which there is a business relationship, this reduces performance. Why? These are related party transactions. And in contrast, when you invest more in unaffiliated companies, that improves performance. So what we want to also look at is what the money is being used for. But this is all important because it's not a one-size-fits-all thing where investment is always good or investment is always bad. Where are you investing? Is it in an affiliated company or an unaffiliated company? This is important, which is why the general tenor of my comments during this conversation is on the importance of discretion rather than one-size-fits-all rules, as long as you are able to trust management and what can affect your ability to trust them. As I've mentioned, it's things such as their track record and their ownership in the company.
지금까지 논의된 주주환원과 지나치게 지배력을 행사하는 지배구조 문제를 해결하는 데 투자자 수탁자 책임 이행이 도움이 될까요? 수탁자 책임이 제대로 이행되기 위한 조건은 무엇인지요?
I do, Dr. Lee. So what is stewardship to begin with? So stewardship is when you have outside investors being actively involved in the long-term running of the company. And why is this useful? You always have an independent perspective. So just like companies will be hiring investment banks and management consultants, often at high fees to provide independent advice, well, you might have a free source of advice, which is your own investors who don't charge you anything. And in fact, one might argue that the advice of your large investors is going to be much more aligned with long-term value than the advice of investment banks or consultancies. I used to work at Morgan Stanley, and how do you get paid? You get paid for doing a transaction, and there's particular concerns that they might try to encourage you to do a merger and acquisition deal, even if it's not value creating for the company. Why? Because you only get paid if you do a transaction. Whereas if you have an outside investor with a large stake in you, then that investor only has incentives to make suggestions if they're truly creating value for a company. So you might want to think about investor stewardship as similar to the role of a venture capital or a private equity firm. So with a startup company, a venture capital firm will not just provide you with money, but advice and contacts and outside challenges. And this is the role of a great investor in a publicly traded firm, which is more mature, is to provide some independent suggestions. But just as with everything, there is pros and cons. So sometimes stewardship can lead into micromanagement, where outside investors are asking companies to do things where they might not actually be best informed. So these might be companies with a lot of growth opportunities. They might be in new economy sectors where it's hard for an outside investor looking at the financial statement to know how the company is actually performing, because a lot of the value of the company might not be in the financial statements. And so in such companies, it might be difficult for an outside investor to really know what is the best course of action. This is why typically in tech firms, in the US in particular, you don't have outside investors really trying to micromanage the company and direct them as to what to do, because one might trust the founder, particularly if they have a large stake in the company, to deploy capital in the best way possible. So I think stewardship should be useful in many cases. If you're an outside independent perspective, if it's based on expertise, the more tailored stewardship is, the better it typically becomes. You can see these one-size-fits-all type stewardships, which I'm more skeptical about, because that is not advice which is relevant for one particular company. It is investors trying to promote these one-size-fits-all practices, which, as our conversation has suggested, are not going to be the best way to try to manage a firm.
한국에서는 최근 코리아 디스카운트 문제를 해소하기 위한 정부의 밸류업 이니셔티브가 활발하게 논의되고 있습니다. 상장 기업으로 하여금 자발적으로 밸류업 프로그램을 마련하고 거래소 자율 공시를 유도하고 있습니다. 최근 일본 기업가치의 상승이 일본 정부가 지난 10년간 추구하였던 지배구조 개선 노력과 동경증권거래소가 상장기업의 가치 제고를 위한 노력의 결과로 인식되고 있기 때문입니다. 이러한 정부주도형 밸류업 이니셔티브가 효과가 있을지요. 혹자는 자율공시보다는 강제공시를 주장하기도 합니다. 의무화할 사항인지요.
I think this is a good initiative. So I like the idea of companies disclosing value up plans and also investors considering these value up plans. So why do I think this is a good idea? So another reason for a discount could well be just lack of transparency, lack of opacity. So if you know little about a company, then you will discount it because of the uncertainty. So when companies are disclosing information to outside investors, they typically like it. Now, in the past, the information that they were asked to disclose are financial figures such as quarterly earnings and so on, but that is relatively less relevant now in 2024 because a lot of the value of a company is its long-term prospects, which might not be fully predictable from financial statements which are backward-looking. So I think it is generally a good idea for companies to disclose their long-term value plans. And similarly for investors, what is good stewardship? It's to look beyond quarterly earnings. One of the concerns that we have with stewardship is if it's focused too much on the short term, then it can lead to some investors trying to fiddle with the company when this is not actually justified. So I think these things are generally good practice. Then you might think, well, if I think these are good things, shouldn't they be mandatory rather than voluntary? And my answer to that is going to be no. And again, this is part of the tenor of the overall discussion that we've been having, Dr. Lee, which is I think things should generally not be mandatory because we don't have this one-size-fits-all idea. Sometimes a company's value-up plans are proprietary and they don't want to disclose it because their competitors could have that information and then that will destroy their correct comparative advantage. And also, given if something is mandatory, I typically would like something to be mandatory if there is an externality that hurts other people. So you might think about a carbon tax. Why do people think a carbon tax should be mandatory? Because you have negative consequences on wider society, and therefore the government might want to tax you for that. But if you think about the idea of a value-up plan, that is not an externality, because if you have a low discount, it is you, the company, that is suffering. You're not imposing externalities on others. So we can think of an executive who does the cost-benefit analysis. They know that if they publish a value-up plan, then there might be an increase in valuation because of the transparency, but they know that the flip side is they might be disclosing some information to their competitors, and they can do that math, they can do that cost-benefit analysis, but because both the costs and the benefits are ultimately borne by the company itself, there isn't an externality there. I don't think there is a reason for regulation and making this mandatory. So I think it's good to have generally good corporate governance guidelines, which are good practices to follow. And that's what the UK Governance Code has done. And I'm not just mentioning the UK because I'm from the UK and I'm biased, but that code is seen to be globally respected, and many other codes from other countries, they are often based on the UK code because that's seen to be good practice. And it's good practice because you have these guidelines which suggest what companies should do, but it's not so rigid as to force all companies to follow those guidelines, even when those guidelines are actually going to be value destructive for one particular firm.
교수님은 최근에 ESG 논쟁에 활발하게 참여하셨습니다. 보기에는 역설적인 제목인 The End of ESG 논문도 발표하셨고 Grow the Pie 책도 저술하셨습니다. 기업 가치는 장기적으로 무형 자산에 의해 영향을 받기 때문에 ESG를 특별 대우할 것이 아니라 기업 가치를 결정짓는 투자 및 생산성과 같은 다른 근본 요인과 같이 취급해야 한다는 취지로 말씀하신 것 같습니다. 부연 설명을 부탁드립니다.
Absolutely. So my paper, The End of ESG, was published a couple of years ago, and you might think, oh, that is a rather strange title, The End of ESG, when I'm somebody who is pro-ESG, as explained in my book, Grow the Pie. But if you read beyond the title, why I'm calling it The End of ESG is the end of ESG as a niche topic. So historically, people have thought, well, ESG is only relevant for the ESG department of a company, or if you're an investor, only if you run an ESG fund should you consider ESG. When in contrast, what I'm trying to stress is that ESG is in many cases important for the long-term financial value creation of a company. This is why my book is called Grow the Pie. When a company invests in its stakeholders, this is not at the expense of shareholder value, it's growing the pie so both shareholders and stakeholders are benefiting. And this is indeed how I got into the topic myself. It was about 17 years ago when I was finishing up my PhD at MIT. I wanted to look at why companies, what creates long-term value. I was just focusing on financial value because that was my job as a finance PhD student, was to research what creates financial value. And I wanted to look at intangible assets. Why? My first job was at Morgan Stanley as an investment banker, and the most important assets were not our buildings. We probably leased our building. It was our people. So this was why Morgan Stanley and any professional services firm, and beyond professional services, nearly every company, they put a lot of effort into hiring the best people and training them and retaining them and motivating them. Human capital is really important. And so I published a paper, it's still my most cited paper, showing that employee satisfaction is linked to long-term shareholder returns. So a company that treats its employees well is not being just fluffy and nice and charitable, it's being sensible and commercially relevant. It is investing in its most important asset. And nowadays we can think about other types of intangible assets, your brand, your trust with customers, your relationship with suppliers, your relationship with the government. All of these are important intangible assets. So even if your goal as an investor is only to maximize financial returns, not to create societal impact, you should take ESG seriously. But there is a flip side to the argument, as there is a flip side to nearly everything that we've discussed today, Dr. Lee, which is sometimes investors might be too focused on ESG. Now there is this excitement about ESG investing. Sometimes investors view ESG as special. They put it on a pedestal above other factors. So there might be some investors who invest in the company primarily on the basis of its ESG, and they ignore other factors like management quality and capital allocation and productivity. If a company has low ESG, they might refuse to invest in it irrespective of those other factors. So the other flip side to the idea of the end of ESG is the end of it as being seen as something special that has a particular halo. I think ESG is important, but it is equally important to other drivers of a company's long-term value, like productivity, like innovation, like capital allocation. It shouldn't be seen as secondary, which is what some people do when they see it as niche, but it shouldn't be seen as primary, which some investors want to do right now because of the excitement that they have around ESG.
또 다른 공시 이슈인데요. 최근 IFRS가 추진하고 있는 기업 지속가능성 보고기준 제정과 강제 이행에 대한 의견이 있으시면 말씀해 주시죠. IFRS의 노력이 성공할 가능성은 어느 정도라고 생각하시나요?
I'm generally quite skeptical about some suggestions to try to improve ESG by forcing companies to disclose. And you might think, well, that's quite surprising because as a finance person, shouldn't I be about data, and haven't I been generally supportive of disclosure during this conversation? But the problem with ESG is many important things you cannot disclose because they are qualitative. Let's think about diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is one popular ESG topic right now. So companies can disclose the percentage of women in senior management, maybe the percentage of women in the wider workforce, maybe the percentage of ethnic minorities throughout the company. But that is only a very small subset of what it means for a company to be diverse and inclusive and equal. Let's think about diversity. Diversity is on many grounds other than gender and ethnicity. Just measuring gender and ethnicity suggests that if you're a white male, you provide no diversity. But that is crazy because a white male might be from a different background. Maybe their background is engineering when everybody else is finance. They might be from a different socioeconomic group than everybody else. And they might think differently. They might be focused more on qualitative factors when everybody else has a more quantitative style. So to reduce something as complex and nuanced as a person's humanity to just their gender and their ethnicity, I think is very reductive. Also, when we think about DEI, it's not just diversity, but equity and inclusion. What do you do? Not just to recruit a mix of people, but to make them feel included and psychologically safe and able to contribute their ideas without fear of failure or chastisement. That is far beyond what you would see in a report of demographic diversity. And in fact, this is backed up by research. So my own research looks at a holistic measure of diversity, equity, and inclusion. It finds it has almost no relation with demographic diversity. And why does that matter? In terms of predicting future performance, my holistic measure of DEI predicts future performance, but demographic diversity alone does not. And so when you focus on forcing companies to report these measures, if these measures are only very partially informative, companies will end up hitting the target, missing the point. They will focus only on the measure to be disclosed. This might be hiring an ethnic minority over a white man, even if that white man is going to provide more diversity in terms of background and also other characteristics beyond diversity that you look for in a person, just such as their raw ability or their commitment and motivation.
오늘 런던의 이른 아침 시간에 저와 중요한 어젠다를 갖고 대화에 응해 주셔서 대단히 감사드립니다. 마지막으로 한국 분들에게 전하고 싶은 말씀이 있으신지요?
Well, firstly, thank you, Dr. Lee, for your interest in my views. And what I'll say just in closing comments to a Korean audience is that there are a lot of arguments about the topics that we've been discussing. I would always want to go back to what does the research show, because I think when you look at the evidence, that can try to disentangle which is the stronger or the weaker argument. And sometimes I understand that the research might not be relevant for Korea because they might be based in the US. But particularly on the topic of corporate governance, there are a lot of papers which are focused exclusively on Korea, or they're generally papers on Asia. And I think even if a paper is on another Asian country, this might be still useful for a Korean audience. Why? Because the governance issues of controlling shareholders, related party transactions, those are more issues in Asia than they are in the US. So even if there are papers on Asia in general, they might still be relevant. And that is why I wrote the book. I wanted to translate that book, Grow the Pie, into Korean as the first language. My wife is actually Korean, so this is a country that I really, really care about. And why? Because I wanted to make sure that the insights of academic research are accessible beyond just the UK and the US, where a lot of the attention is given. And so when I wrote the book to begin with, it was based on academic research, not just wishful thinking. And it's great now that it's been translated into a number of languages. So hopefully that will be an inroad for people to try to look at what does the best academic research say on issues such as stewardship, dividends and buybacks, the value of ESG for financial success, and all of the topics we've discussed together.
이번 KCMI 글로벌 이슈 시리즈는 런던 비즈니스 스쿨 알렉스 에드먼스 교수와 주주환원과 기업가치를 주제로 얘기를 나눴습니다. 주주환원이 원칙이고 기업의 장기 성장과 상충되지 않는다고 했고, 경영자 판단에 의하여 예외적으로 환원하지 않을 경우 주주에게 설명할 의무가 있다고 했습니다. 지분이 많은 대주주일수록 기업의 장기 성장성을 도모하지만 반면에 소유권과 지배권 간 괴리가 클수록 기업 가치를 떨어뜨리는 경향이 있음을 설명하였습니다. 논의의 말미에서는 무형자산의 중요성을 강조하였고 지속가능성 논쟁에 대한 에드먼스 교수의 견해를 들을 수 있었습니다. 기업가치 제고 방안 논의에 건설적인 기여를 할 수 있기를 바랍니다. 시청해 주신 여러분께 진심으로 감사드립니다.